If I would just go, I would tell ChatGPT kind of the points that I want to make and then go like, yeah, make this more sophisticated and then just copy paste it. And then I go into an interview, for example, people would be like, well, the CV sounds so much different than you sound now. This doesn't really go together. I think people are really missing the point if they just go or copy paste it and give these generic answers. We're already able to detect those and not really an advantage. Startup where we scaled from 50 to 150 over the time I was there. As a start for me in recruiting, that sounded crazy already. And I was like, that's so cool to be part of that.
We are live on the Objective Hiring Show. Today we're joined by Sharon. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you here. And where I love to start with all the guests is just to hear a little bit more about yourself. Who are we listening to today?
So I'm Sharon, based in Munich, currently a senior talent acquisition partner at Personio. I've been in recruiting for 8 years now. Have started also in Munich at a smaller SaaS startup where we scaled from 50 to 150 over the time I was there. As a start for me in recruiting, that sounded crazy already. And I was like, that's so cool to be part of that. And then I realized, was interested in more and wanted to continue the journey in tech. And then the opportunity came up at Personio. Decided to join them, where we scaled from 800 to almost 2000 by now. So even bigger growth journey in terms of recruiting and hiring and talent. Also pretty exciting. And yeah, that's where I'm currently today.
That's wonderful. And Personia has been so successful over the past few years. Tell us a little bit more about the company for those who might not have seen the product before.
Yeah. So we are an HR SaaS tech company. So we are developing a solution which helps company to manage the entire HR lifecycle. It's B2B2C. So the main users are on the one hand the HR managers of the companies, right? But then ultimately also the employees that can do all their administrative tasks in the tool. We really want to make the lives of everyone involved in that journey easier, making sure that all these tasks are as done as fast, as smooth as possible. And yeah, we have offices across different locations within Europe. We also opened an office in New York a couple of years ago. So very present, yeah, across different locations.
And I guess one of the interesting things throughout the last few years, I imagine, is you've been able to use your own product to do the hiring as well, which I think is really interesting when you start to be your own user, because then I think, at least in theory, the kind of feedback loop starts to get shortened. You know, if you're using your own product each day, like you really feel what's working, what isn't working. So I imagine there must have been a lot of, I don't know, improvements and innovations that came about through your own people using the product as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very nice benefit as a recruiter, because you are so close to the product group, and also specifically for me now, I'm hiring for product and working directly with all our product leadership and product managers, and it's very cool to see that you see something not working in the tool and being able to feedback that great. Still, we have kind of roadmap planning and things like that. So it doesn't mean that it always will get immediately solved, but like there's also still priorities and thinking about capacity and so on. But just being able to also to give feedback and being part of that journey is very nice. And also obviously then also to see all the developments within the tool. So very recently we've done a big rebrand, but also came with a big improved UI. And that was also fun to see, and then obviously even more fun to use the tool.
Is there anything that you've seen in the way that like customers use Personio that Personio doesn't use the product in the same way? Like, is there some yeah, real difference with how you approach it internally versus how customers use it?
I don't think so. I think it's pretty straightforward. Obviously, there's a bit of kind of nuances or things that you can tailor the way you need it, right? So there might be definitely a couple of differences, which then also depends a lot on the size of the organization, right, or their specific needs. But I think generally it's pretty straightforward, and I would say at least similar across the board.
You mentioned just earlier that Personio had opened an office in New York a couple of years ago, and so moved or uh, added that kind of North American hiring focus as well as all the hiring in Europe. I'm interested, have you noticed any big differences in the way hiring works between those two markets or the way candidates approach things or anything that surprised you in any way?
Yeah, I think generally it was a big shift for us to move to US hiring. It's definitely a very different market from Europe. And at the time when we started, we also started doing the based out of Europe. So in the beginning, we didn't have any recruiters based in the US, so didn't have any people with all the knowledge about it, right? So we kind of did that from scratch, and then later on also hired US recruiters, which made it a little bit easier to manage that. Nevertheless, it's yeah very different market, very different approach. Also, I think in general the talent we try to approach and find in the US is also obviously talent that is highly sought after also by other sought after by other companies, right? Um, and it's yeah, so it wasn't easy at first. There's also um, just I think the market is moving so fast, right? And candidates move so fast that it was sometimes very difficult to, on the one hand, um, place Personio in their minds also as the company to work for, because obviously there's also a lot of US companies that might be bigger already, right? And things like that. So on the one hand, a selling persona to them and making sure, hey, it's really worth it to join such a high growth startup based out of Europe, being part of that journey without having any branding, any of them knowing Personio as a company, and then also just throughout the application process. As I said, it's much more fast moving. Also for them, also given kind of notice periods and so on, right? And even though we always definitely try to be as fast as possible, and I think we do have a fast recruiting process, it's still sometimes just impossible to compete with. Also, then the speed that potentially other companies operate with.
Yeah, that would be a big challenge because I imagine Personio in the German market in particular, for someone in tech, would be one of the absolute best places to work that everyone would know about and it's growing so quickly. But then you enter this new market where maybe the average candidate hasn't even heard of the company at all. And so it's such a different approach, I guess you have to take. Did that involve then, I don't know, having to up the ante in terms of the offers or kind of make it somewhere more attractive on the other end if candidates weren't as already cool? I want to work at Personio. Like that wasn't their starting vibe, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so we tried, I would say, um to figure that out with kind of what we have in the sense, right? Because hiring in the US is also much more expensive anyway. And we still needed to be a bit cost conscious in that sense, right? So we weren't like, okay, we will give them all the benefits that they want and need and things like that, right? So we had to really do it by positioning the company, positioning our brand. Also, what we did is throughout the application process, we really tried to involve um, our leaders that maybe have been on similar journeys or similar companies, or also relocated from maybe even the US to Europe for persona or things like that. So to really try to making them aware of the potential it has and the benefits and the opportunities. So I think that's more the way we try to convince them. And luckily, it also worked for some of them, but obviously not all.
And what about for some candidates is the attraction that they want to end up moving to Europe? Like, is that part of it? Or are most of them looking to stay and work in New York?
Yeah, I would say both. Most of the talent we had there was also then talent that we spoke to people that were planning on staying in the US. So it wasn't that we kind of had a lot of candidates that then relocated. Um, but it was also some of them, right, that were open to it and really motivated. And obviously, then it's also a little bit easier because, as you said, particularly in Germany, but also in other countries, Personio already has that brand and is already known for it. And obviously that then also has an effect, and yeah, made the storytelling a little bit easier.
You mentioned that even with Personio's already quite fast hiring process, entering that market in the US, the average competitor was maybe as fast or sometimes even faster. When I've spoken to people from US versus Germany in particular, I assume one factor behind that is like almost like risk tolerance, because in America it's like almost the idea is you hire someone, if they don't work out, you fire them. Whereas in Germany, it's very difficult to do. All the process is very cumbersome, or you've got these really long notice periods. So I'm wondering, did even the hiring managers who are hiring people, did they change the way they thought about who they hired, or even the process or their risk? I'd love to hear any thoughts there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would say definitely on the process. So especially in engineering, we went through really a big kind of reorganization of the process and looking at the bottlenecks and thinking about, okay, how can we actually improve it and make it even faster and smoother for the candidates, because I think they're also very used to quite, let's say, high quality structured processes. And I'm not saying that we didn't have that, right? But I think they are just kind of used to that, and we also wanted to make sure that we can kind of compete with that and deliver on that. And that's why we professionalized our process even more, because obviously also with our own growth journeys, the processes that we had 2 or 3 years ago don't work anymore today. And it's on the one hand then with entering the new market in the US, but obviously then also in general with kind of the growth of the company, or also the volume of hiring, because then ultimately what we did, we started with kind of a US pilot of the process, which we tried there, and then saw, okay, it's working, it's making the process faster. Let's also move it to Europe, because we can ultimately also benefit from it, because it's not that it's completely different type of hiring, right? In that sense, thinking about kind of the profile and risk, I wouldn't say that didn't change so much. I think it was still very much, again, also associated with generally the cost of hiring. Obviously, it's easier to let someone go also faster compared to Germany, right? Just because of the timing. Nevertheless, at Personio, we are very proud of the culture we are building here and of how kind of the teams work together and collaborate with each other. And um, a mishire still um, can still have kind of negative effects on the team, right? Even if it might be then faster to make a decision, could have an impact on kind of the morale of the team, or kind of, yeah, general team sense. And that's what we still try to avoid, and that's why it was still very conscious decision making in that sense.
And you mentioned culture, which was something else I was going to ask about. I guess part of the challenge would be, I mean, this is a broader thing than just hiring, but how do you maintain the same culture in a new office and a new continent? Or is it not maintaining? Is it just an evolution where you know that you're going to hire different people from a different market, therefore inherently it's all going to be a little bit different? Like how is the cultural element included in the hiring approach?
Yeah, I think it's somehow both. On the one hand, maintaining the culture that we have, but somehow also an evolution, which I also think is natural. Right? I think culture always evolves, and then it also as part of kind of the growth journey, and also the different people and talent that we are bringing in. So I think there's always some parts that will evolve, but then also kind of the core parts would also stay and maintain the same because they are so crucial. And one of them I think is kind of the team and how we collaborate and work with each other, and that really um, kind of collaborative culture in that sense, which is super important for us. And I think that's something we still looked out for when hiring, and which was still important. Um, and there wasn't any specific change to the hiring process, because at the end of the process we always do kind of a culture interview anyway. So we maintain that also in that process, and then obviously, but pay close attention to um, would that be a fit and would that work? Obviously, it's challenging, especially with a new office, right, where people are really hired into that office without kind of someone being there already um, to be a culture ambassador in that sense. So it's a lot about then doing that through our virtual collaboration. Um, but I think overall it's something we succeeded in, and can be very very proud of that we have the culture and even across continents, and can do that across the ocean.
We were talking about culture, and I was going to mention the last business I worked for years ago now, which was headquartered in Australia, but we had offices in a few different markets, including Thailand and South Korea. And I remember going to, in particular, the South Korea office once for an event. And it was like if they took our culture and did the exact opposite of it. That was what it was. I was struck by the fact that two offices of the same company were like chalk and cheese. It was unbelievable. You went from like the most laid back Australian, irreverent, walk around the office with no shoes on, have a beer with your lunch if you want to structured, orderly, hierarchical boss, second boss, third boss, like turn up at 1 past 9 and you're in trouble like you are at school. Like it was an amazing culture shock in a way. um, and so on one hand, I feel like, oh, well, maybe that was a failure to not get alignment. But on the other hand, the business is absolutely on fire in Korea. It would made hundreds of millions of dollars. So does it really matter? If at the end of the day, it's all working well. Like I'm wondering, after a couple of years now, if you've noticed any like distinct differences between the culture of, let's say, the Munich office and the New York one, and if that even matters.
Yeah, good question. Um, I would say I haven't. Um, I think part of it is also because New York is still also very small. I think we have about, let's say, maximum 50 people there, even if. So it's just, I think, also in terms of size, right? It's so much smaller than the rest of Europe. So I would say it's no, even after those years, it seems pretty similar. But always also a little bit hard to tell when, because I haven't been to the New York office, so haven't been on the ground. Maybe I would go there, would be more obvious to me. But so far with the people I'm working with, I don't really see it.
Yeah, hopefully you can get over to New York soon. That'd be a pretty once in a lifetime trip. That would be cool.
Yeah, definitely.
You'd mentioned when we spoke recently that you've been doing a lot of hiring of product managers, the kind of PM space. And so I'd love to hear more about that experience because there's such essential roles in tech companies in particular. And yeah, hear about how that's going. And then also, I don't know if you have a sense of like common ways where candidates are successful or unsuccessful in their applications, and love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I took over product hiring over a year ago. And before that, at Personio, I did product operations, program management, security, data, engineering, and moving into product was quite a different space. Because, as you said, on the one hand, it's such a, I mean, every role is crucial in an organization, but ultimately, product they are building the product that we are using, that we want to sell, and so on, right? So it's such an important part of the organization, and that's why it's also honestly it is a bit challenging to find a strong product managers, right? And product managers that fit the profile that we are looking for. So it's yeah, it's been a very rewarding experience because like we talked about earlier, right, you also get to be so close to the business of them and what they're doing in our product itself, what we're also using. But it is a bit of a different recruiting experience as well, because honestly for me as a recruiter, um, it's also not always super easy to find out who could be a good product manager, because I think, for example, with security or engineering, even though I'm not in those roles myself, so obviously I also don't have kind of the technical background. Personally, I think there's a lot of hard facts in that sense, right? Where you can go, or also data, right? Where you can go. They have this and this and this experience, and obviously, I still don't know if they are very good at it, but I just based on the CV, I can say, well, also when sourcing, um, let's do a first interview because on paper, um, looked like a good candidate. Whereas in product, it's very difficult to tell, because on the one hand, also in the role of a product manager, obviously they're strong in selling their ideas, selling their product, selling themselves too, right? And it's hard to really grasp, okay, how how do they then use their skill when building their product, um, putting the user at the center of what they do, and things like that. Especially also, yeah, when screening CVs, um, it is a different type of screening, because it's really about still about what they write and how they present, right? Where we go in engineering or security and be like, okay, the CV ultimately doesn't really matter to us, because um, they need to have the right technical skills, and it doesn't matter so much if they are now able to really tell us a great story about it. It's so much different in product, because um, it's still at least a bit of a sign of how they use that skill, and if they put effort into it or not, right? So I think that was definitely a big difference.
In my experience of working with product managers, you get a wide variety of quality. I can put it nicely. Where on the upside, you almost get this person who's driving the whole product. They're almost like the mini CEO entrepreneurs, making everything happening, like the glue. They know they can dig into the data, they can set up the vision, they can find the bugs, they can help the engineer. Da, da, da. And then on the other end, you get the person who's kind of master of none and jack of none. They don't really do anything. They're not the ones building the product. They can't dig into the data themselves. They're not driving it. They're not prioritizing the backlog, and they're just kind of doing nothing other than sending emails. Is that a fair summary, or am I being harsh, do you think?
Maybe a little harsh, but still a fair summary, because I think that's exactly it, right? And it's hard to also, when you interview and someone is telling you about that experience, understanding, okay, what did they actually do in it? How or did they even, right? As you said, sometimes they would maybe just see themselves as just kind of holding holding things together or things like that, right? Without actual being hands-on, or as you said, driving into data or things like that. So yeah, definitely something that I've experienced too, and that's hard to grasp from even not only my interview, but I think general throughout the whole recruiting process.
Yeah, that's still, I think, one of the fundamental problems in hiring for any role really is if a lot of it's based on an interview, you, at some level have to take their word for what they're saying and what they're saying is true. And you can dig in and you can have your experience. But if you're like a really good blagger, you can really spin a good yarn and tell a good story, then you can get pretty far. Often hired actually, and then that's where sometimes it all comes unstuck. But do you have any, like, you must have developed like a bit of a sixth sense over the years for detecting if someone is really being fully honest? Like, is there a sense of being able to, like, you have to dig further, you can't take the superficial answer, or you want to hear numbers from them? Like, is there anything that stands out to you as they're bullshitting or they're honest?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think there's definitely two things I try to do. So on the one hand, it's really digging deeper, so really going and so kind of they start with the story, right, and then really talking about, okay, and what was your responsibility and why was that challenging and how did you do that, blah 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 blah, and going the more detail you get into, the more you realize, okay, is that person still talking about their own experience, or are they now making things up because the total story doesn't add up anymore in that sense. And then yeah, the second thing for especially for PMs is really on impact and numbers, and talking also about metrics, right? So usually at least from my perspective, if they would just go and kind of go like, yes, and I did this and then I did this and then I did this, it's, I would say, not a bit of a flag, right? Because usually they should be talking about, okay, and this is the impact I've made, and this is why this feature was important, and this is kind of the user need that we were able to solve, and then over time we saw the I don't know, improvement in that, or things like that. So being able to tell the story, talking about the impact and talking about the why is already a good start to detect if that could go into the right direction.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's so important, obviously, as a candidate to do as much preparation as possible. Like, even if I were looking for a new job myself in 6 months, I would really sit down and just start by thinking and documenting, like, what have I been doing? What are my achievements? What exactly was my contribution? As you say, getting the numbers behind it, and just work all that stuff out of my head into some kind of coherent explanation. Because without that in an interview, if you can't explain it in the way that you've just described, you sound like you're maybe lying, even though you're not. It's just you haven't thought about it in enough detail to be able to articulate to someone else. So that preparation is so important. I often think, in theory, you should be writing your resume like all the time, updating it with everything you bring, because every 4 years, how on earth do you remember what you've just done for the last 4 years? You know?
Yeah, I agree. I think that would help a lot of candidates, right? And then also thinking about not also being specific, right? Because ultimately, the more specific, the more interesting it also gets at some point. Because high level, I think that we can all imagine what a product manager, an engineering, or whatever role, right? What they are doing. But ultimately, it's interesting to hear what specific and what was the journey over time and so on. And I completely agree. Also, if I think about myself, um, if someone would ask me, okay, what did you do at the start when you started at Personio? I would probably say, I don't know, because it's been 4 years.
Yes, time flies, and you're right. The specifics really matter. I think maybe even more now, because large language models are so good at creating some kind of vague, wishy-washy summary thing that sounds fine at first glance, but it's like, it's the details that are now maybe even more important, because it's going to help you stand out either in the CV or the interview or any other stage. Like, it's the uniqueness, the real bits, I guess.
Yes, yeah, yeah, definitely. We also definitely also see that, right? When and by now it's like you see a CV and you're like, okay, has someone really written that, or has someone just asked ChatGPT and copy pasted what should a product manager be doing? And the more specific you get, and the more you talk about, in for example, numbers, that's where we then go, okay, that's a story, right? But I must also say, some people go into so much detail already in the CV where even I'm like, okay, I don't understand what this person is talking about anymore, or using a lot of abbreviations or anything like that. So it's about finding that balance with thinking also, who's my audience? And thinking about, okay, I want to be specific, but I also need to keep in mind the person that I'm writing to in the first place. The CV is also not someone from product.
Yeah, that is really tricky, I think, because you're right. When you first apply, the first person reading it is normally someone in talent acquisition, recruitment, HR. Then ultimately, I guess the hiring manager will look at it after that at some point. But now maybe there's a third player coming in, which would be your AI large language model, which I guess will start to screen a lot of the resumes as well. So that makes it, I guess, quite hard for candidates to write at the moment a single document that could hit all those audiences in the same way. I'm not sure the way around that for them. Maybe we'll end up. One thing I was thinking about was maybe this idea of, oh, you have to have everything onto a 2-page resume or 3 pages. Maybe that will go out the window if, let's say, in a couple of years' time, it's mainly large language models that do the screening, because then they can read 2 pages, 1,000 pages, doesn't really matter. So I wonder if people will end up submitting like this really big document, and then you'll have like some summary out of it that a human could then read. What do you reckon?
Yeah, true. Interesting thought. I haven't thought about that because uh, today when I'm screening a CV, right, and it's like 4, 5, 6 pages even, or even longer, I will go like, okay, I obviously I don't want to say I'm ruling someone out just based on that, but it's already a flag, because if you can't summarize what you're doing, then usually that's also a sign that when you would have to prepare a presentation or anything like that, but that would become completely obsolete, right? If you know that the AI can do it for you, and maybe it's even interesting then um, for you and then the recruiter to do it. So yeah, I would be very curious to see the development. Um, and yeah, it's an interesting thought, because I'm just thinking, how would then I know how this person can still be concise in their communication, right?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think the impact so far of ChatGPT, Claude, other large language models has been, uh, either positive or negative, like on the candidate side. Like I hear a lot about them, of course, using it to write a resume. Some people chance their arm and actually use it in an interview. Sometimes that goes badly, but then I hope some are also using it to prep for interviews and brainstorm. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the use so far.
So I think, generally, I feel like it's helpful for them to better prep and take more time, but ultimately, I think it helps those candidates that would prep anyway, right? Because they usually then also use it in a way to kind of better prep, and kind of do do get more ideas, or maybe inputs, and or maybe also sometimes it's also just in terms of how you phrase things, right? And it's not saying that they couldn't do it without without, for example, ChatGPT or any other tool. But sometimes it's just thinking about myself, right? If you're doing an interview not in your native language, it's good to get some ideas about that. Um, and I think, yeah, it's helpful for those candidates, because I think for the others, that, as you said, right, it can also go the wrong way. And if you just use it because I don't want to sound too harsh, but because you're lazy, then I think it's something you can see, right? Because then it's just an extension. You would just be reading off the script more or less. You will just copy paste. Um, and I think maybe we will get there at some point, but right now the quality is not that good that you can just go, I will copy paste that. And then I think also it's, when Wikipedia came for the first time and people started to copy paste from Wikipedia, which also didn't work. And I think it's, at least for now, the same with AI. But like I said, probably they will get better, right? And they will learn more and will learn more about you and so on. But just currently, it's too generic.
Yeah, it is too generic to do, as you say, just the complete copy and paste. Don't even look at it. Like that's not a match winning strategy. There was one usage I'd seen recently when we were doing our own hiring that I wanted to ask you about. So, as part of our evaluation, these were for sales development roles. We asked the candidates, "Oh, like imagine you were successful and you got hired, and it was day one at Aluba. What are the three things that you would need from us to give you the best chance of being successful in the role?" And I was amazed at how many candidates had clearly just copy and pasted ChatGPT's answer to that, which I found a bit crazy because I was thinking, well, I don't care what ChatGPT thinks. This is like a personal question about you because I care about you as an individual, setting up your onboarding and your training. I don't care what a large language model thinks, right? And I just found that bizarre. But maybe I'm missing something. What would you think in that scenario?
Yeah, I would agree because I would say it's still, you are still, as a person, you want to present yourself, your thoughts, your ideas. And again, I think if you use it to support it or take your thoughts and maybe make them more extensive, because I think some people might also be like not as kind of communicative or not as good in storytelling, right? And if you want to be like, okay, this is my idea, but I need some help on how to kind of sell this idea or talk about it. I think that makes complete sense, but I think people are really missing the point if they just go or copy paste it and give these generic then answers, because I think we're already able to detect those, and then it's not really an advantage, right? And how would you then know to prepare a good onboarding for the person when you ask them, what do you need from me? And the answer is just like, yeah, something from a tool that ultimately might not even help you. And imagine you still hire the person, they start, and they will be like, oh no, I wish I would have thought about this question a little more and actually get something which is more helpful to me.
Yes, exactly. We would have done the three things they asked us to do. And like, why on earth are you doing these three things? Well, that's what you told us to do. No, 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 it was the large language model. Yeah, it would be a big mess. I tell you what, if I were a candidate now, I feel like I would probably maybe almost go against the grain and have a like aggressively un ChatGPT written resume. At least then it has a chance of standing out among a sea of thousands of other resumes, maybe standing out in a good or a bad way. How would you approach it if you were looking for a role in the next couple of months? Yeah, how would you go about writing at least your resume?
Yeah, I think I would still use it to, so for example, for myself, I think I struggle sometimes with kind of selling myself and also writing a lot of text, and going really into, okay, this is all the great achievements I did. So I think I would still ask for a little bit of help in kind of making a little bit more, also then a little bit more sophisticated in that sense. But I would also be very cautious, right? Because then if I would just go, I would tell ChatGPT kind of the points that I want to make, and then go like, yeah, make this more sophisticated, and then just copy paste it. And then I go into an interview, for example, right? And people would be like, well, the CV sounds so much different than you sound now. This doesn't really go together. So maybe just that kind of that making it a little bit more polished, getting some insight, but still making sure it sounds like me and I still see myself in it and it still sounds authentic and I don't feel like, oh my God, I'm sending something. And if someone asks me about it or then speaks to me, we'll be like, okay, that doesn't match.
Yeah, I think you're right on the authenticity because that's going to become, if it wasn't already important, maybe even more important now, because we're living in this weird, the physical world is real, and then suddenly the online world is increasingly unreal in a sense. Online dating, sales emails, recruitment, like it's all the same kind of pattern I see, where people are kind of getting annoyed at the disconnect. So yeah, the authenticity and sticking to that, I suspect, will work well for candidates, but we shall see.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's got to be interesting.
That's my hypothesis. I haven't tried this at all because I haven't applied for a job for 10 years. So maybe if I do in the next year, I can put my money where my mouth is and see how that actually works.
Yeah.
Um, have you seen any good uses of AI in hiring on the hiring side? So either, I don't know, helping to prepare interview questions, or I don't know, any kind of exciting use cases you've seen?
Yeah. So I think just for myself or being in TA, I think it's super useful because I think question banks, right, is super helpful because ultimately, as a recruiter, right, I mean, um, so I've moved a lot across the different roles, which I already talked about, right? And I always have to onboard myself and now think about, okay, what do they need in product, for example? But also recently I've picked up product operations again. And the last time I did product operations was 6 months ago. So I use then ChatGPT to go like, okay, what kind of questions could I ask? Um, and think about, because it just gives me an idea. And then again, I still need to be authentic in the interview. I can't go into kind of too specific questions, because then people will probably question a bit how I would know all about product operations in detail, why I'm asking these type of questions or things like that. So it's about then choosing what really makes sense, where I can still go into a discussion about the candidate, because I still need to understand the answer, for example, right? And I think with like it doesn't matter if it's product management or product operations or program management, but these are what I would say a bit more of these softer type of roles, in the sense that you would always usually understand what they're talking about, right? Whereas in engineering, it could even get more tricky if you rely on questions that you don't have any clue about, and then they talk about very technical things, and ultimately someone will ask you, so how was the interview? Did you like the candidate? And you can't give an answer to that because they completely went off the rails. Um, Yes, so I think in hiring, especially for TA, there's a lot of use cases. I haven't spoken to the hiring managers about, but I could imagine that it also helps them to derive question banks, right? Because probably the ones I'm not choosing, they might be choosing, because they're like, oh yeah, that's a good question to really dive into um, the um, the details of it. So I think it's definitely for the first part of the interviews. Once we kind of get to the case stage, for example, so at Persona, that means a take-home assignment and presentation. Obviously, there can also be some inspiration from ChatGPT, but we also developed this ourselves and really thought about, okay, what makes sense, and then culture interview. So the longer you go ahead in the journey, I think the less you can use it, at least for now, because obviously the culture interviews and the interview where it gets really specific and is really tailored to persona.
Could you see an AI doing an interview anytime soon for Personio?
Um, Good question. I would say, hmm, probably. I don't know how fast that development will go, right? And how fast, how good it will become. So that's a bit of a question mark for me. But I would say ultimately, why not, right? Because it's very clear criteria that you can give, very clear scripts. I think it's more of the question of how fast we also advance to the stage where it becomes so normal that I wouldn't feel offended as a candidate that I'm just speaking to an AI. Um, and I'm not sure how fast that development will go. Maybe we will already be there in a year, but can also be only in 10 years. Let's see.
Yeah, I think that's a great shout. And I wonder if in other bits of society it just becomes more and more normal to talk to AI, for example, I don't know, in customer service or going to a bank or something, and you no longer deal with humans. And then it's normalized. And then suddenly getting interviewed by an AI for a job is not out of the ordinary. So, yeah, when that takes place, I guess time will tell. Nobody's got the crystal ball.
But also, just as you said that, right? I think it's also when I just think about myself and using these chatbots in customer service, they're still, I think, so soon this point where you can't get any further, and you're like, I just want to talk to someone to get my question answered. The bot can't answer it, so please, someone help me. And I think there's also, yeah, a lot of development to still happen there. Also interesting to see how fast that will go.
Yes, the number of times I've opened up a chat button, the first thing I just say is human in all capitals, exclamation point. Let me talk to a bloody human. So, yeah, I can imagine we'll have to get the experience right for candidates to adopt it and be happy with it. Sharon, if you could ask our next guest any question about hiring, what would you choose to ask them?
I'm really interested in best practices, so I think I would ask about it's probably not the most kind of creative or crazy question, but I'm always interested in um, efficiency and what they do to ensure that they have an objective hiring process, but also still a very fast process. And if there's anything we can learn from that.
Okay, love practical tips. I will ask those questions to our next guest at some point next week, and I'll let you know what they say. Uh, Sharon, it's been a great chat today. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.